Hi, I'm Devin, the creator and designer behind Aurora Lead Designs. This is a video tutorial on how to saddle stitch. I am going to be demoing the saddle stitch technique on one of my single pocket card holders in this blue Saffiano leather. This is the same technique if you are saddle stitching the clutch, whether it be the handle onto the body of the bag or the side of the clutch, it's going to be the exact same technique of stitching. So saddle stitching is a unique form of hand stitching in that it uses 2 needles to complete the stitch. So to measure out how much thread you're going to need, you are going to take the side that you're going to be stitching and you want to measure 4 times the length, giving a bit of extra thread just so you know that you won't run out. So that's a little more than 1, and then we're just going to multiply that by 4. That's 4, squeeze off a little bit extra just in case. And then we are going to thread a needle onto each of the ends of this cut thread. I like to fold it like that just so the thread doesn't accidentally slip out of the needle eye. So now you have this U shape for your thread that has a needle attached to both ends. So next, you want to match up the stitching holes on the front and the back of your piece. So the easiest way to do that, we are going to be getting our stitch down here. So the easiest way to do that is to take the top stitching hole where your side is going to be completed, and then find the corresponding hole on the back and taking them side by side, just matching those up, pressing the side down until you find your first stitch. And a way to double check that you're at the right spot is that on the fold of the bottom of your piece, in between the first stitches on both sides, there should just be plain unmarked leather. So we are going to, so when I'm doing this tutorial, I'm going to refer to this side as the front of the card holder and this side as the back of the card holder. And I'm going to be referring to these as needle A and needle B. And it doesn't matter, I'm not assigning the needles, it doesn't really matter which one you start your stitch with. So once you've matched up the very beginning hole, and just for reference, the reason that I'm starting the stitch at the bottom of the card holder and not at the top of the card holder, it's just a personal preference. We're going to conclude the saddle stitching with 3 back stitches, which is basically the same thing as saddle stitching but moving in the opposite direction. It creates a little bit of a bulkier looking stitch, and so I personally think it's better to have those bulkier stitches at the top here where they'll be covered by the card holder flap when it's completed. But again, it really doesn't matter which side you start at. So we're going to take needle A, and so I am working with needle A and the front side of the card holder, and you are going to take needle A and you're going to thread it through the bottommost hole on both the front of the card holder and the corresponding bottommost hole on the back of the card holder. And so once you've threaded the needle A through both of those, you're going to take both needle A and needle B and pull them so that the amount of thread on each needle and each side of the piece is even. So now we're going to flip over to back to the top of the card holder, the front of the card holder, and we're going to take needle B. So needle B is the one that's already has the thread and the needle sticking out through the top of the card holder. So taking needle B, we are going to thread that through the second hole, moving up towards the top of the card holder. So you're going to thread it through the second hole, again, on both the top of the card holder and that same corresponding second hole on the back of the card holder. And so once you've threaded it through, you'll see that we're starting to see the formation of our first stitch. You're also going to take both of these needles and just make sure that they're still at an even, consistent length. So now we're going to flip over to the back of the card holder, and this is how we're going to finish our first saddle stitch. So you're going to take your needle A, so that's the very first needle that you stitch through this bottommost hole with, and we are going to thread needle A through this second hole that needle B has just gone through on the back side of the card holder, and that's going to complete our first saddle stitch. So I would recommend, if it's not too tricky, taking this needle B thread and pulling it back a little bit like so. That will just make it easier for you to thread this needle through and not accidentally puncture the thread. So we're going through the corresponding second hole. We're going through the back second hole and the front second hole. And once you've looped it through, you'll see that this is our first full saddle stitch. It's forming a full loop on both the front and the back sides, and I'll give you a little look of what it looks like on the inside. So that's our first full saddle stitch, and you'll see again that we have the threads. We have a thread on each side of the card holder, the way that we started out our first stitch with. And you're going to take these two threads and just pull them together so the stitch is taut against the leather. So now we are going to take the same needle A and we're going to continue doing the exact same stitch up the card holder side. And so again, we're starting with, just like we did in the beginning, the front of the card holder facing towards us. And we're starting again with needle A, and needle A is going to go through the third hole on both the front and the corresponding third hole on the back of the card holder. And again, I would just keep checking as you go along, making sure that your thread is staying, oops, accidentally lost the needle there. Making sure that your thread is staying consistently even on both sides. That's just important so that you don't get to the top of the stitch and then realize that you have way too much thread on one side and not enough on the other. It's something that you have to worry about mostly in the beginning when the thread isn't as stitched down and it can more easily shift in the lengths. So again, we just threaded needle A through the front third hole and the corresponding back third hole. So we flip over the back of the card holder. We're going to pull this needle A and thread back, and then we're going to take our needle B, which you'll see is coming out of the back already in this second hole. We're going to take our needle B and thread it through the third hole. So again, just make sure the stitch is nice and taut against the leather. Same thing. And we're just going to continue the same stitch all the way up the side of the card holder. And if you accidentally skip a hole or thread through the wrong holes, it's totally not a big deal. Just unthread your needles and then just pick the thread out until you reach the point before that so that you can just redo those stitches. And again, just want to give the threads a nice little tug to make sure that those are staying nice and tight against the leather. And if you're ever having an issue seeing where the punch holes are, since the leather is punched with it already laying together, the punch holes are usually a little bit easier to see on the front than they are on the back. So if you're ever having trouble seeing where the punch holes are on the back, you can bend the leather and it makes them a little bit more apparent. And so now I'm stitching through the very last hole at the top. So you're going to stitch through that one to finish off the saddle stitching just like we began. And then we are going to do, so we're going to pull that tight. And so you'll see that we've now stitched up the top on both sides. And so now we are going to finish by back stitching, which is very similar to back stitching that you would do on a sewing machine. It's going to be the same saddle stitch, just in the reverse direction. And the reason that we back stitch is so that over time, you know, the leather is being pulled and bent a lot. And so the back stitching helps with hand sewing in particular to make sure that the threads don't come unraveled, because the ends of the threads are going to end up down here as opposed to right at the top, and it will be a lot harder for them to unravel over time. So we are going to begin the back stitching process, again, exactly the same way that we started with the saddle stitching process. You are going to take, I'm going to just call this again needle A, and needle B. And so with the front of the piece facing you, you are going to take needle A, and you'll see it's coming out of the uppermost hole on the front of the card holder, and you are just going to thread it through the next lowest hole. And you're going to go through, again, the same stitching hole on the front as well as the corresponding stitching hole on the back, and pull it through. Again, I'm going to just tuck that out of the way, take needle B that is on the back of the card holder and thread it, which is also coming out of the very topmost stitching hole, and we're just going to thread it through that same second hole that needle A just came out of. I'm going to pull that tight, and there is the first full back stitch. As you can see, it's a little bit bulkier than the single saddle stitch, which again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, is just why I prefer to end it up here. And so we're gonna do the same thing, taking the needle that is on the top side of the card holder, and now we're just going down to the third hole, flipping over to the back side of the card holder, taking the other needle, pulling that thread back, and taking this other needle and going through the third hole. And we are just going to do one more of those. And we will finish just how we started, with one needle on top and the other needle on bottom, both coming out of the same hole. Give it one last tug, and then we will take our thread snipping scissors, and you want to get a cut as flush to the leather as possible. So I'm like really up against it, just so that for aesthetic reasons, just so there aren't any loose threads. Same thing on the back. And there you have it. So a full saddle stitch with 3 back stitches on one side and the other, and then you're just going to go through, and it doesn't matter. So I'm working with the left side of the card holder here. It's going to be the exact same process on the right side of the card holder, or whichever side you're going to be working on your piece. And that is how to saddle stitch.